So I was able to do this during the morning instead of the afternoons I initially had thought. Again, events tend to change around. Um, Let me begin this with the disclaimer that I think Kennedy's service during World War II was impressive. That's about it. So, when I first became interested in politics back in late 2013 and kind of full scale in early 2014, I would frequently, if someone were to ask me who was my favorite president, say JFK. And you know, looking back at it, because that time coincided with the 50th anniversary of his assassination, where there was this respiked interest in his tenure and what happened and his death and all of that. We say hello to Dirk. I don't know what that well then means. You're gonna have to elaborate on that. And I don't know what exactly caused it to where I basically completely flipped around because back when I first got into much of this, I didn't have the same positions on certain issues. Um, so and seeing people constantly and consistently bring his name up. Um, when I read these articles about the top 10 presidents and various other accolades, and one day I just sat back about, I think it was in January of this year, and I thought, you know, from every president between FDR and him, or rather FDR and Trump, I can't think of a single piece of legislation that he signed or act that he did that didn't involve giving a speech. Um, and that's significant because many times when you ask people what do they remember about him, they will admit it's some speech he gave. You have to, we choose to go to the moon one. I'm not saying addresses cannot be significant or impactful. No, well, NASA started under Eisenhower, and then LBJ expanded them, and then after a year after he left office, they landed on the moon. So even that you can't give him. What I'm saying is that think about this. With FDR, you have the New Deal, which is Social Security, among other things. um, with Truman, you have the house. What was that? The Housing Act, the Employment Act. That started being forced to revamp. Yeah. Well, NASA was established under Eisenhower. Is all I'm saying. Um, but continuing with Eisenhower, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1957. That was one of the first legislative acts in favor of just knocking out discrimination we've ever seen up to that point. LBJ will be here all day. Medicare, Medicaid, um, food stamps, the public broadcasting system, uh, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Gun Control Act of 1968. Um, with Nixon, you have the Environmental Protection Agency, the first SALT Treaty. I guess technically the Philadelphia Plan, even though that was, we can get into that later. But continuing further, yeah, well, I'm just saying, look, even in bringing up Watergate, Watergate, war on drugs, both awful, horrible things. But even in bringing that up, you can still see where I'm saying that with most of these other presidents, there's some law that they haven't. If I were to continue going down that list, the only one I couldn't think of anything um, directly to attribute to would be Ford. And Ford already is kind of. I mean, no one will ever say he's in their top 10 presidents. So I don't. He is where he should be effectively. I don't dislike Ford either, but he's not considered at the pantheon of great leaders. But going further down the list, you have with Carter, for example, um, Camp David Accords, the Government Reorganization Act, the Second Salt Treaty. Um, I mean, just Then with Reagan, you have the tax cuts and the whole Reaganomics thing. It's the Martin Luther King Day bill getting signed. Who else? Then with the older Bush, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1991. With Clinton, you have NAFTA. Well, it started under the older Bush, but was implemented under Clinton. You had NAFTA. You had the Brady Bill, sweeping gun control reform. Defense of Marriage Act, which I think was horrible, but whatever. The repealing of Glass-Steagall, something else that I think is horrible. Um, then with Bush, or the younger Bush, you have the Patriot Act, the Iraq Resolution. Been in that, we were in that war for 7 years, or eight technically, 2003, 2011. Um, with Obamacare, the Iran nuclear deal, restoring relations with Cuba, Trump, the tax cuts, um, moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. You get the idea with all of these different presidents, other than maybe Ford. And if I sit here and think hard enough, I can probably remember something. You can tie some act or thing they did, um, whether it be good or bad, to say this person's significant, this person was eventful. With Kennedy, it feels like every time I read a defender of his, it's always someone saying, well, I found his speeches. There's a video I used to watch. It was someone's tribute video to him, and they said JFK is one of my favorite presidents, and I just kept tuning in. Just why? And they put his speeches, his charisma, his charm. What? I had an instructor about 2 years ago, in the days leading up to the this last presidential election, who was talking about how Lincoln was the best president by far. No one comes close. Which I don't agree with, but whatever. Uh, and he asked, one of the kids said, what about JFK? And then he said, what about JFK? I was there. Teachers was in his late 60s. I was there. He didn't do anything. The only reason people mention him is because he got murdered. And that's it. And it's sad because if you actually think about just the entire pantheon of politics, you can make the case that both of Kennedy's brothers that served in Congress were more impactful than he was. With Ted Kennedy, you obviously had the one of the most early pushers for universal health care. I mean, we have traces of him doing that starting in the 70s, and the fact that it didn't technically come to pass until Obamacare, I think is a testament of how long he was rallying behind that issue. Um, with RFK, you have a person who bailed Martin Luther King out of jail, negotiated with the Georgia governor, Ernest Vandier. Um, JFK's campaign manager aligned himself with the civil rights leaders. It's been pushed forward that he was the main one backing the Kennedy administration to become more serious with civil rights after JFK's death. Entered the Senate and was protesting the Vietnam War. When you had all those hawks telling LBJ to stick over there. So there's many things that those two did that are significant and impactful, and actually put them. If someone were to say those two were the greatest senators or among the greatest, I couldn't argue with them. But it's as if only with JFK is there this thing where people kind of shut their mind off. I'm going to tell you the real reason why both genders, and yes, we're going to go into that, have their favoring of him. Now, if you go on sites like Instagram or Tumblr or even YouTube, for that matter, there are a number of tribute videos or photos of JFK, probably more than any other president. And one of the things you're going to continuously see, and this is, I mean, I don't expect people to get into the nuances of what someone actually did anymore, because we have this thing where once we see that person's face, we just kind of push out anything that's serious. Um, but if you go on those accounts, you'll find a number of images that people have put up of him. And a lot of times there'll be some female on the account and talking about, oh, he looks so good. There was one woman I spoke with. She had two accounts. She had a regular account where all she would do is post drawings. She was a very talented artist. And then she posted a picture of JFK and said, "Oh, I have this intellectual crush on him." And so I sent her a message and I go, "Hey, so other than Kennedy, because I knew she wasn't from the U.S., what other presidents do you like?" And she said, "I don't know that many, but the ones I know I don't like." And then she listed LBJ and Nixon and Bush. And so when she says Bush, I ask her, which one, and she doesn't elaborate. So I just kind of get stuck in my ways. But I realized at that point, this is a person whose entire liking of JFK is the fact that she wishes that she could travel back to before November of 1963 to have sex with him. Because everything that JFK advocated for either came to pass in LBJ's Great Society or later on became a law, or just there's nothing legislatively that Johnson differed from Kennedy in advocating for, being in favor of. He gets credit for heading off the missile crisis that JFK had caused in the first place. But I'm glad you mentioned that. Um, and if you go and read those biographies, or you go and look at any of these documentaries, it's always he was calm and collected. He said this, that, and the other. It's never anything beyond giving a speech, and that's what's so frustrating about, I guess, sitting here and being into the nuances of what did this person do, what did that person do, and then you get to all these different like most historians, whether you like to admit this or not, think the way I do. That's why the top three presidents in almost every poll are always Lincoln, Washington, and FDR, and it's always over things they did. No one's sitting there, and none of these female historians are going, "Oh, look at FDR in that wheelchair." None of them are doing that. Um, they're going off of actual laws that were implemented under their tenures and how successful they were in the office. People, and they've mentioned this, that there is a public gap. There's a gap between how historians rank Kennedy and how the public ranks him. And I think what's worse is that in many recent years, we always see Kennedy in the top 10 presidents. And every time I said, go, why? How is he as good as Truman? I had one of these different women that were on on Instagram post that, in her opinion, he was the best president of all time. And I said to her, that's not being objective, because, I used to say my top five, or if, people ask who's your favorite, I would always say the ones in between Hoover and Nixon. And that was FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. And Kennedy, from the time I started saying that late last year or the year before that, was always ranked at the bottom, because he was the one that did the least, but that was in favor of the things I thought were progressive, and so was kept in that list because the ones around him were still in that similar pantheon. It just sounded easier to say these five rather than these three, and then skip that one and the next one after that. Um, so it became this thing of just trying to figure out, how do people not look at things objectively? I mean, if I wanted to really break down who I personally like, it would be Truman, Johnson, and maybe Carter. And I don't think any of those three were the best. I think they're in the higher pinnacle. But I'm objective enough to say none of those are better than Lincoln or FDR or Washington. And again, historians are objective enough to say that. So to have this one person start talking about how he was the greatest when all he did was give speeches and uh, you know say a couple of things that people liked and look pretty enough for women to want to travel back in the past to go and do stuff with him that couldn't be aired on television back then, is almost asinine, because it basically tells you, and it kind of, this is the scariest part about him being as significant as he is. We're never going to get to a point where people applaud accomplishments over um, attractiveness. So I went over and was on Instagram again, and there was one person who was posting all of these various pictures about Obama. or just with Obama rather. And I thought to myself, she's posting images of a guy who this is someone that I know is African American. I said to myself, this is someone who joined Clinton in exploding the prison population. Putting it's been proven half of the African Americans that are in prison right now are in there over drug offenses. Um, and so you have a president who is beloved by many African Americans, while at the same time allowing 50% or at close, it's like 49 or 48% of African American inmates to stay in prison over violating three strikes rules and marijuana and other, non-violent crimes. And this is someone that gets lauded and is being lauded online right now. But if you go up to her and ask her, "Hey, do you like, Bush, whichever one?" She'll go, "No," and likely will not be able to tell you what he did that she was so opposed to, because whether you like it or not, many of the things Bush, at least the younger one, did, Obama kept in place. The Iraq War for a number of years, obviously Afghanistan, the wiretapping state, the mass surveillance, the lack of action on the banks. And I'm bringing these up, and people are going to ask, why don't get off topic. This is to tell you that because she finds Obama physically attractive and just likes the way he looks, she will overlook the fact that many of the things he did as president, which is the only reason, because we know if it had just been, if he had lost in 2008 and just been Senator Obama and sat in there for another 10 or so years, he wouldn't get remembered. Certainly not the way he is now. Um, the only reason she liked him, as it was confirmed from her response to that, is because of how he looks, and that's a problem. People should be, I think, more challenging of those who just go out and say Kennedy is their favorite, because you can almost guarantee those saying it don't have a direct reason for why they're saying it. And I guess from just, I don't know what caused my rift with, I don't want to say people who like him, because I don't dislike him, but just I've gotten to the point where now it's sort of a what exactly is so good? What is so overblown about what he did in office? Because if you think about it, I could pretty much take, let's see who all has been in the chat today. I could take P Capes TV or Dirk, or anyone else who's usually regularly here, and put them in office and have them say a couple of things for 2 years, and it would pretty much be the same. It's just a script. It's not, oh, let me, sign this executive order, or just all of it. It feels terrible, and I hate the fact that if you go and read a lot of these articles from, these commenters or commentators who call themselves being, historically privy, they do this thing where I've actually seen some of them try to say that Obama was the culmination of, Kennedy's whole youth and charisma thing finally coming to fruition. That Clinton messed it up because of his affairs with, obviously Lewinsky Gate, and then Johnson was rugged or whatever, and some other claim about Carter. But all of it is designed to completely subvert the fact that when it comes to good things that those two did, they're far few and in between. They don't want to acknowledge that, and they do the same thing with Reagan, where the Republicans like to praise him, come hell or high water, when in reality, he is probably the second most overrated president. Because if you look at his social policy, that was pretty terrible. You avoid the AIDS epidemic. Really, the only thing I like about Reagan was immigration, giving him amnesty. Um, but there's really nothing of him that's that special. Personally, the older Bush is much more an exception than his son, or the president he served under as vice president. But that, whatever, that's another story. So it's things like that where people who see this will say, "Oh, well, this person is conservative leaning," um, and it's got nothing to do with that. It's just I am tired of seeing presidents who did things, um, get completely overlooked in favor of one who didn't do much of anything other than flap his gums. Okay, Dirk, if are you saying highly overrated about Reagan or JFK? or both. I mean, you wouldn't be wrong if you, in my opinion, if you said the last one or either of those. Basically, there's no wrong answer to that question because they all have things to go after. Yeah, I figured he would probably be the next one to do something like this on, even though it wouldn't have the same level of "Ooh, I wonder who it is," where people are speculating and guessing. But I mean, just I really hate this new retroactive world we live in, where suddenly, um, if you try to say any president was good, that's not. It basically it's like this: conservatives will tell you that JFK was the end of the Democrats being decent, and then liberals will tell you that JFK was this ardent supporter of civil rights. When if you go back in history, um, gets more attention for no reason. Yeah, Dirk. Whether you like it or not, I argue that Reagan was transformative as a president. Um, that's where we had this whole ideological conservative thing start up. But Kennedy's whole thing is just, I think a lot of it has to do with the assassination and also people not wanting to accept the fact that he really didn't get much of anything done. That's a tough pill to swallow. What else was I gonna say? Oh, so yeah, one of the things I really hate about his legacy when it comes to conservatives is that I've actually seen some of them try to do this retroactive "he was the last of the decent" thing. Um, and I guess this goes back to how I hate how people will try to make someone seem like they were the greatest thing alive after they die, and then we have proof that that wasn't the case. If you go back, because one time I was on Facebook and this guy put this lie on there or this thing that was completely factually wrong. He said that um, Reagan left the Democrats because he after supporting JFK he was dismayed by LBJ. That's completely false. There is a letter that Reagan wrote to Nixon where he said that Kennedy had the boyish haircut and was the same old Karl Marx. And there's another article if I can pull it up. I'll look for it where Goldwater, the Republican nominee in '64, this is months before Kennedy's assassination, accused him of playing dirty tricks to get something passed. Effectively, what I'm conveying to you is that this whole thing of partisan distaste and oh I hate you and all that, it continued up until the day he died. That's why he got murdered. You had law. This whole see people try to make it seem as if contempt for the other party started with the current era where bipartisanship died 20 or 10 years ago. It's been dead for much longer. People just retroactively try to make it seem as if he was this well liked, very popular president in all circles, and just a couple of racist Southerners didn't like him standing up for blacks, when in reality, it was because of his lack of action on doing anything civil rights related that his younger brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had to pressure him, along with civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King, because he didn't want to ward off support from conservative Democrats in his 1964 reelection campaign. So it's just this continuous game of rewriting history, making everything seem peachy dory, and it was not that way at all. The only thing he was slightly better than Trump on in terms of outside of rhetoric is the inclusiveness of his comments, and also that his affairs didn't get leaked out and become the subject of the news media talking about it hour after hour because he had a good relationship with the press and he thought that in maintaining those friendships with people in the news media he might be able to get away with having those romantic indulgences. And look, I'm trying to be fair to him because for as much as I'm harping on his record or lack thereof one, I don't, I'm not going to cite him being with various women as the reason for him not doing anything in office. I don't think he, you know, should be criticized for that at all. Because personally, I don't think that should be how we determine one's historical value. There's much commentary given to MLK and having affairs. Not even, if that were that true, I still wouldn't say it undercuts the significance of that person in history. I would just argue that out of all of these past presidents, except again for maybe for all the ones post or pre World War II, like from FDR until now, JFK is probably at the bottom of in terms of historical significance. You know, um, name me a law that people are going to go back and say, "Oh, remember when Kennedy signed that?" Name one. I can't think of a single one. And it was the same way for Ford, but again, he doesn't get heaps of praise about how he was the last real president, and he was the final the final say of the common man, and he cared about the people, and all the ones afterward have been corrupt, and yada yada yada. Um, I really abhor, and why do you think JFK was the last Democrat who was with the NRA? People find anything they can to try and make him seem as if he was so distinct and special. And in truth and reality, other than being right on civil rights, I don't see what else he was that good in. Even if you go back to when he was senator, there were other senators who were correct on that issue. If we actually acknowledge presidents for their past careers, LBJ, smokes him as a senator. LBJ is considered one of the most effective lawmakers in modern American history. Back when he was a senator and then as president, he was a master negotiator. Um, but you had other senators who were progressive as well, or were in favor, were right in the ways that Kennedy were, that aren't looked at. You had Hubert Humphrey, you had Estes Coover, um, I think Stuart Symington as well. Just there were various politicians at that point who were in favor of many of the things that JFK gets credit for. So we know it's not people who are so, you know, um, interested in the issues. It's just people who are sad about the assassination. They wish they could redo it, they could get rid of it so they could actually have something to give him credit for. And they try to rewrite history to make it seem as if he was beloved, when in reality he was as hated as most of the other modern presidents. And that's why he got murdered, unfortunately. Um, and the sad fact is that not only were most presidents of the modern era more significant, but actually, yeah, but half of his brothers were more impactful too than he was. So all of it is just this really weird selection of things. Let me say hello to Sea Lab Beach. Um, yeah, I can't stand this era I found myself in, where people make him. It's almost like a second coming of Christ thing I get with him at this point. Didn't his brother try running? Yeah, well, both of them. RFK ran in 1968 Democratic primary, got murdered, and then Ted Kennedy ran in the 1980 Democratic primary against Carter and got smacked up because he ran a weak campaign. So yeah, to answer that question, but like I said, the brothers actually have records that are of decency, um, and can actually be considered amongst the top pinnacle of lawmakers. With him, it's just this constant hero worship, and I just get so tired of it, because I'll just be reading an article and they'll say, "Oh, top 10 presidents," and then he'll just pop up in there, and I go, "Why?" And someone will go, "Well, he said this, like, but this person did that, this person did this. So what are you talking about?" I mean, I will be almost, my mouth used to kind of get sort of agape. You open up when you see the articles, and after a while, you just kind of get used to it, but you still never fully embrace this idea that people who did more are going to be ignored much longer, because women of the current era who aren't really into history but just want to see things that attract them don't find these other, presidents physically attractive, which I told you before. If you don't believe me, go and look up those JFK tribute accounts on Tumblr or Instagram, or I think even on Twitter. Most of them are ran by females who, if you try to engage on things political, won't be able to tell you much. I had one I spoke with for a while. She could tell you about the Cuban Missile Crisis, a little bit about the Civil Rights Movement. I started asking her about Eisenhower, who is JFK's immediate predecessor. She goes, Uh, and look, I'm not saying all of them are, not um, aware of these things, but it's scary to think you have that much praise for this man, and so much so you can't even tell me anything about the guy who he took the job of, the direct predecessor of. But again, this goes back to the whole thing of celebrity versus um, accomplishment or position. So it's the same thing with Bush and Obama. You go on these Obama tribute accounts, you ask them if they like Bush, they'll probably say no. You ask them why. If they give you a reason, surveillance state, Afghanistan war, they're you could argue they're hypocrites because Obama did the same thing, and they won't come out and go, yeah, that's sure. If they do, they try to amend it. I told you about the one guy that was blindly worshiping Trump after berating Obama for not getting out of Afghanistan. I said, wait a second, he Trump's kept us in there for over a year, and you say you're pro-war, you're pro getting out of wars, and then they go, well, I don't favor an immediate withdrawal. And I said, wait a second, we've been over there for almost 20 years. Are you kidding me? What? If it's not time now to get out, then when is in another 2 decades? So it's things like that where you catch their person they really like in doing something that most others did that they criticize the other ones for doing, and they kind of start backtracking on it. Well, it wasn't as bad as but yeah. To kind of close this out because I was expecting a little bit more participation from the chat room, but it is what it is. I would say that his conserv so the I'm most bothered not by his record but by how he's remembered. Even though because his record doesn't warrant it in my opinion. Um, I don't like his conservative support because again, you have these Republicans that try to make it seem like uh, after JFK, it's either after JFK that's the last real president, or other than JFK and Reagan, the other presidents weren't significant when that's anything but the case. Um, and then with liberals, it's oh yeah, we love Kennedy, we love Kennedy. Oh ooh, and that kind of started with Clinton, and that kind of kept up with Obama, and then it's been going ever since. Um, Unfortunately, so I'm tired of the blind praise. This man wasn't Jesus Christ 2.0. He did decent things. His brothers did more. Other presidents did more. Suck it up. I've sucked it up about my favorites. I don't consider them the best or the in the top three even. But I can give you valid, substantive things they did that make me feel the way I do about them. And I would hope that his supporters and I was really enthusiastic about people being attracted to his celebrity because I thought maybe if they like the way he looks enough to learn about him, which some of them did, but when it came to trying to learn about others, and like I asked one about the Paris agreement, Trump pulling out of that. Literally like 2 or 3 days after it happened, she didn't even answer me because she didn't know anything about it. So all of it, and I know this is a person who didn't have contempt toward me because she was answering all the stuff relating to JFK prior to that. So it's a continuous cycle. I'm tired of it. I really wish people would actually go and celebrate accomplishments over, oh, this person said this person gave this speech. Forget that. I've chosen to ignore that in favor of actual things that people have done. I don't get attracted to lawmakers based off of how pretty they are. In this upcoming election, out of all the Democrats, I would say that Harris is, I guess, the most physically attractive, but in terms of the most policy attractive, I'd say Sanders. And O'Donoghue is literally coming at the end of this stream. I was not expecting the bomb in terms of people who chose to who showed up, uh, but I didn't think I'd get this opportunity. I might do it to where this one's about JFK, and then one later on today might be about maybe Reagan or something. We can just do two in one day, and then during the afternoon we can do the other one. So that might happen. Um, yeah, I hate how this is, and I just hope that people will, if they're going to be in politics, like people for what they did. So that's just my opinion. Thank you.